The studio froze. The orchestra went silent. And Johnny Carson put down his microphone. It was November 1991, a Tuesday night like any other at NBC's Studio One in Burbank. The Tonight Show had been America's bedtime ritual for nearly 3 decades. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, the same desk where he told 10,000 jokes, interviewed 5,000 guests, and perfected the art of making 30 million people feel like they were sitting in his living room. Doc Severinsen stood where he always stood, trumpet in hand, leading the band through the same familiar theme that had opened every show since 1967. Ed McMahon sat in his chair to Johnny's right, ready with his legendary laugh. The audience, 200 strong, settled into their seats expecting exactly what they'd come for, an hour of perfectly orchestrated entertainment. But tonight would be different. Because tonight, Johnny Carson was going to break every rule he'd spent 30 years perfecting. The studio didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness the moment that would define what television could be when it stopped being television and became simply human. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The monologue had gone smoothly. Johnny delivered his jokes with that familiar timing, that slight pause before the punchline, that look to the camera that said, "Can you believe this?" The audience laughed in all the right places. Doc and the band punctuated each joke with musical stings. Ed McMahon's laughter boomed across the stage. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it had been for 4,531 episodes. But those who knew Johnny well, the cameramen who'd framed his face for decades, the stage managers who could read his smallest gesture, Doc Severinsen who'd stood 10 feet away from him for 25 years, they noticed something different tonight. There was a small white card on Johnny's desk. Not a cue card. Not a joke card. Just a plain white envelope that hadn't been there during rehearsal. Johnny kept glancing at it between jokes. His hand would drift toward it, then pull back. He'd touch it with one finger, then continue with his monologue as if nothing had happened. Doc noticed. From his position with the band, he could see Johnny's tells. The way his jaw tightened just slightly. The way his eyes went distant for half a second before snapping back into focus. In 25 years of standing on that stage together, Doc had learned to read Johnny Carson better than anyone alive. Something was coming. Doc didn't know what. But he knew Johnny. And he knew this look. The commercial break came. Johnny didn't move from his desk. Usually he'd chat with Ed, adjust his tie, make a joke with the audience. Tonight he sat perfectly still, looking at that white envelope. "Johnny?" Ed's voice, quiet, concerned. Johnny looked up. "I'm fine, Ed." But his voice had that quality it got when he wasn't fine at all, when he was working through something too big to process in a 2-minute commercial break. The floor director counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2. They were back. But what happened next, no one, not the producers in the booth, not the cameraman, not even Ed McMahon, was prepared for what Johnny Carson was about to do. Johnny looked into camera one. That direct look, the one that made every viewer feel like he was talking only to them. But this time there was something different in his eyes. Something the audience had never seen before in 3 decades of perfectly controlled performance. "Before we bring out our first guest," Johnny said, and his voice was different too. Softer. No performer's cadence. Just a man's voice. "I want to do something I've never done before." The audience stirred. This wasn't in the script. Johnny picked up the white envelope. "This morning I received a letter." He turned it over in his hands. "From a man named Thomas Walsh. From Denver, Colorado." He opened it slowly. The studio was completely silent now. Even the audience members who'd been whispering to each other stopped. Mr. Walsh is 73 years old. He's been watching this show since 1962. Never missed an episode. Johnny's voice caught, just for a second. "He wrote to tell me that he's dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 2 months." The silence in the studio deepened. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something else. But that's not why he wrote. Johnny looked down at the letter. He wrote to tell me that for 30 years, every night, he and his wife watched this show together. It was their ritual. Their time. After the kids went to bed, after the dishes were done, they'd sit together on their couch and watch The Tonight Show. Johnny paused. His hand trembled slightly holding the letter. His wife died 6 months ago. The collective breath of 200 people was audible. And Mr. Walsh wrote to say that even though she's gone, he still watches every night. Still sits on that same couch. Still laughs at the same jokes. Johnny's voice was barely above a whisper now. Because for 1 hour every night, it feels like she's still there. Then Johnny did something he'd never done in 4,531 episodes. He stood up from behind his desk. He turned toward the band. Toward Doc Severinsen. Doc, Johnny said. And in that one word, in that one name, there was 30 years of friendship, of standing together on that stage, of music and laughter and the thousands of unspoken moments that create a bond between two men who've spent more time together than most marriages last. Carson stopped mid-moment. The entire studio held its breath. And what came next would change everything. Doc stood frozen, trumpet still in his hand, his usually jovial face suddenly serious, suddenly vulnerable in a way the camera had never captured before. Doc, you've been standing right there for 25 years, Johnny said. His voice was steady now, but it carried a weight that made every word land like a physical thing. Every single night. Through everything. You've been there. Doc nodded slowly. He knew something was happening, something important, but he didn't know where Johnny was going with this. I've never told you this, Johnny continued, and now even the crew members stopped moving. Boom operators held their poles perfectly still. Cameramen forgot to adjust their frames. The entire machinery of television production simply stopped. When I started this show, I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. Everyone knew Jack Parr was irreplaceable. Everyone said I'd fail. And for the first year, they were probably right. Johnny took a step closer to the band. But you know what got me through it? That theme song. Every night. Knowing that no matter how badly I'd done, no matter how many jokes had died, no matter how awkward the interviews had been, I'd walk through that curtain and you'd be there, playing that song, and everything would be okay. Doc's eyes were glistening now. This was not the Johnny Carson he knew. This was someone else. Someone more. I've never thanked you for that, Johnny said quietly. In 25 years I never said thank you for being the constant. For being the one thing that never changed when everything else did. The audience wasn't just silent anymore. They were witnesses to something sacred. Johnny looked back at the letter in his hand. Mr. Walsh, if you're watching tonight, I want you to know something. That couch you sit on, that empty space next to you, that feeling that she's still there when the show comes on, that's not just memory. That's not just habit. That's love. And love doesn't end because someone is gone. It just changes shape. He turned back to document. Just like this stage. This band. This music. It's been the constant in 30 million people's lives. Not because of me. Not because of the jokes or the guests or any of it. But because every night, there was something reliable. Something that said you're home. Backstage, producers stood frozen. This wasn't television. This was confession. And no one dared stop it. Johnny walked toward document. Not quickly. Slowly, deliberately, each step carrying the weight of 3 decades. When he reached the band, he stood directly in front of Doc Severinsen, this man who'd been more than a bandleader, more than a colleague, who'd been a brother in every way that mattered. I'm retiring in May, Johnny said, and even though the announcement had been made months ago, hearing it again in this context, in this moment, made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. And I'm scared, document. I'm terrified. Because I don't know who I am without this. Without you standing there. Without that music. Without walking through that curtain. Doc's trumpet hung loose in his hand now. His trademark bright clothes, tonight a purple suit with a yellow shirt, suddenly seemed out of place, costume pieces in a moment that had stripped away all costume. But Mr. Walsh's letter reminded me of something. Johnny continued. It's not about the show. It never was. It's about the constancy. It's about showing up. It's about being there even when you're scared, even when you don't know what to say, even when the world doesn't make sense. He put his hand on Doc's shoulder. You taught me that. You, standing right there, every single night. Never missing a show. Never letting me down. Always there. Johnny's voice cracked. So I'm saying it now, in front of all these people, in front of America. Thank you, Document. Thank you for being my constant. Thank you for being the reason I could walk through that curtain with confidence even when I felt none. Thank you for making magic out of thin air, night after night after night. Doc couldn't speak. His mouth opened but no sound came out. In 50 years of performing, through big bands and small combos, through Johnny Carson and years before Johnny Carson, Doc Severinsen had always had a quip, a joke, a musical response to any situation. Not now. Now he was just a man, standing in front of another man, both of them caught in the gravity of a moment too big for words. Then Doc did the only thing that made sense. He lifted his trumpet to his lips. And he played. Not the theme song. Not a joke sting. Not any of the thousands of musical cues he played over a quarter century. He played something slow, something tender, something that sounded like memory and gratitude and goodbye all woven together. The studio remained absolutely still. The audience didn't move. Ed McMahon sat frozen in his chair, tears streaming down his face. The cameramen kept their frames steady, capturing this moment that would be replayed for generations. Johnny stood there, hands still on Doc's shoulder, and let the music wash over him. Over the studio. Over America. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different from any silence that had ever existed in that studio. It was complete. Perfect. Sacred. Then, slowly, one person in the audience stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds the entire studio was on its feet, applauding, not with the wild enthusiasm of entertainment, but with the quiet reverence of having witnessed something true. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny turned back to the camera. His eyes were red but his voice was steady. Mr. Walsh, I don't know if you're watching tonight. But if you are, I want you to know that the space next to you on that couch isn't empty. Your wife is there. Just like Doc is here. Just like all of us are wherever we need to be for the people we love. He picked up the letter again. You wrote that you didn't know if you'd make it to May, to the final episode. And you wanted to say goodbye now, just in case. Johnny folded the letter carefully. Well, I'm not saying goodbye. None of us are. Because goodbye suggests an ending. And what we have, what you have with your wife, what I have with Doc, what 30 million people have with this show, that doesn't end. It changes. It evolves. But it doesn't end. He looked directly into the camera. So instead of goodbye, I'm saying thank you. Thank you for 30 years. Thank you for sitting on that couch. Thank you for being constant in a world that never stops changing. Thank you for reminding me why we do this. Johnny sat back down behind his desk. For a moment he just sat there, hand on the letter, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked up at Document. Maestro, I think we need a commercial break. Doc nodded, lifted his trumpet, and played them into the break. But even the familiar notes sounded different now. Heavier. Fuller. More real. The commercial light went on. The audience erupted again, but this time not in applause but in something messier, more honest. People were crying. Strangers were hugging. The carefully controlled atmosphere of a television taping had dissolved into something more like a revival meeting, a moment of collective catharsis. Johnny stayed at his desk. Production assistants approached cautiously, unsure if they should speak, unsure if the moment was over or if it was still happening. Ed McMahon walked over to Johnny's desk. He put his hand on Johnny's shoulder, exactly as Johnny had done to Document. No words. Just presence. Doc set down his trumpet and walked over to Johnny stood. The three men, Johnny Carson, Doc Severinsen, Ed McMahon, stood together in a triangle, hands on each other's shoulders, not speaking, just standing there while the audience watched and the cameras kept rolling even though they were in commercial. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds contained 30 years. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When they came back from commercial, Johnny picked up the show as if nothing had happened. He introduced the first guest. He did his bits. He made his jokes. Everything returned to the familiar rhythm of The Tonight Show. But everyone who was there that night knew something had changed. Thomas Walsh died 3 weeks later. His daughter sent a letter to the show. She wrote that her father watched that episode 7 times before he passed. That he kept saying. Johnny understood. The white envelope stayed in Johnny's desk drawer. When he cleaned out his office after the final episode in May 1992, he took only 3 things: a photo of his sons, Ed McMahon's cigarette lighter from opening night in 1962, and Thomas Walsh's letter. Doc Severinsen kept his trumpet from that night. Never played it on the show again. When asked why, he'd simply say, "Some notes are meant to be played only once." Years later, young talk show hosts would study that episode in broadcasting classes. Not for the technique. Not for the comedy. But for the moment when television stopped being television and became simply human. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can say to someone isn't scripted. It's just the truth. And Johnny Carson, after 30 years of perfect performance, finally told Doc Severinsen his. The studio remembered. America remembered. And somewhere, on a couch in Denver, an empty space held more presence than absence ever could.